Okay, so this right here is an RC10 T3. I picked this up not too long ago because I would like to enter it in the next RC10 Talk Vintage race. One thing that they're going to do that's new for this next race is to have another stadium truck class. So in the past they had a two-wheel drive buggy, Y2K two-wheel drive buggy, four-wheel drive buggy, and stadium truck. So the Y2K class is meant for chassis that were manufactured after the year 2000. And all the other classes are chassis basically manufactured before the year 2000, although for four-wheel drive buggy there might be a slightly different cutoff there. So the thing with the T3 is that if you look at the sort of evolution of the stadium truck design from the 10T to the T2 to the T3, and at which model generations they incorporated certain features, it's kind of staggered a little bit from what they did with the buggies. So I'd like to just kind of go over that briefly here if I could. But maybe before I get into that, I just want to point out that this is a really simple chassis. I already kind of knew that when I bought it, but it is interesting when you actually take a look at it. Very, very simple to put together. Not that many screws to access, basically to take apart the front to get to the rear gearbox. Very straightforward chassis, and it's very lightweight because it has a carbon composite chassis instead of the older style aluminum tub chassis. So I'm not sure if I'll have to add weight to this to get it to hook up nicely on the track. Like I have some longer style LiPo batteries that are higher capacity. Maybe I'll try using those to help weigh the truck down. Otherwise, I fear it might actually be a little too light. So we'll see how it goes. The only thing, so this particular truck, when I got it, I believe it's a factory team version of the T3. You could tell by the front tower here. It's like a carbon composite tower instead of a graphite tower. And strangely, the factory team front tower has only 2 mounting holes for the inner ball stud. The non-factory team tower has 3 holes there, so it's actually a bit more tunable. Kind of strange. There may be some other features to this which make it factory team. I'm not 100% sure. I'm not too familiar with the 3rd generation of chassis, but it did also come with titanium turnbuckles. I believe those are factory team, and MIP CVDs in the back, as you can see. Very nice condition. This little RPM motor cover I got off of another T3 that I picked up for parts, because it's kind of hard to find T3 parts, strangely enough, especially suspension arms, and these caster blocks and spindle carriers. So I basically had to buy another chassis to make sure I had spare parts just in case. So other than that, the only other thing I kind of did here was to make a small modification to the battery mount to make this a bit more accommodating for different LiPo sizes, because the way that this cover goes on, if you put a standard LiPo in there with a standard thickness, it is a bit of a tight fit. So one thing you can do, instead of having the normal setup where there's a screw that would go in here with a hole in the screw head to mount an E-clip, I just threaded like a 3mm, a long 3mm grub screw or set screw into the same hole, and then I just have a little thumb screw here to screw the battery cover down. So that way, with a long set screw, I can pull this whole thing up, and I can pull this cover up a bit just to give me a bit more room to mount a slightly thicker battery. Other than that, very easy to set up. The servo mount is easy to access, very similar to the B2 over here, and the 4th generation of chassis, the B4, the T4, mounts very similarly. Electronics, plenty of room to mount the electronics. Very simple truck. So, okay, let's maybe take a little step back and take a look at why I think it's kind of interesting the way they developed the truck chassis. Now, I don't have an RC10T first gen here to compare to because I actually sold all of those off. I didn't really like those too much. But we can look at the T2 and compare that to the B2, and maybe that's a good starting point. So the RC10 B2 second generation buggy has the carbon composite chassis, just like the third generation truck. But the second generation truck has an aluminum tub chassis, just like the first generation buggy. Although you can see the geometry is a little different, right? They angle this in a bit more. The older style chassis are a bit more square like this, but still an aluminum tub chassis. Okay, so that's kind of a carryover from the first gen, and then the front portion of the chassis also has some carryovers from the first gen, like the suspension arms are, if I remember correctly, the exact same arms you would use in the 10T first gen. The caster blocks and spindle carriers, same exact parts that you would use on the first gen RC10 as well as the second gen RC10. Okay, it's only in the third generation buggy and truck that they switched to a different caster block style, which was only for the third gen. Once they went to the fourth gen, they changed this yet again. So with the third gen chassis, the caster block is such that I believe this is a single hinge pin here from the ball stud all the way down through the spindle carrier, and it mounts a little further out compared to the older caster blocks where this ball stud mounts further in like this, and you have a separate hinge pin on the outside. So you're going to have a shorter camber link on the older style chassis compared to the newer chassis. That will change the geometry a little bit. Also, the steering, the spindle carrier has a longer arm on it compared to the older style spindle carriers on the second gen truck, second gen buggy, the first gen buggy. So different suspension geometry and steering geometry up front. So that's one thing to note that separates the T3 from the T2, even though geometrically they look similar because the chassis look kind of similar. So that's one thing. The shock towers are similar geometrically, but on the T2 you don't have any extra mounting holes for the inner ball stud here. It's just one hole. Again, you get 2 holes here for the factory team tower and 3, for whatever reason, on the non-factory team towers. A bit more tunability up front here. The way the front shocks mount on the suspension arm is also slightly different. So on the arms here, you have 2 holes that you can use, and this little nub here is actually part of the arm itself. It's one singular piece. But on the T3, you have this nub here that has 3 holes, so you get an additional hole, but it's also a separate piece that mounts onto the arm with 2 screws from the backside. 1, 2, okay? Actually, I'll take this here, and you can maybe see more closely these 2 blue screw heads. So 2 separate parts. That reminds me a lot of the Kyosho RT6. It has a very similar setup. Of course, the RT6 came out way after the T3. The T3 predates that. So this is, I think, the first stadium truck where you would see this kind of arrangement on the suspension arms with these 2 separate parts here. And then in the rear, kind of the same thing, where you have, a bit hard to see with the lighting, but a similar kind of component here, but on the back side, you have something that mounts onto the holes in the arms, and then it kind of, you have his little ear here, and then the shock mounts to that ear. Now you can do the same thing on the T2, the 10T, and the RC10 GT. I think the part originally came with the RC10 GT. It was an extra piece that you can mount onto the arm to basically give you extra droop at on the rear. I don't have that on the T2 right now, but I do have those parts. So you can do that too. And what's interesting is the older generation part that you would put here actually has more holes, is more tunable than this part here. You only get 1 hole to mount the shock to if you want to use that part. And you don't have to. You could take that off and just mount the shock directly to the arm, but then you get less droop. And even with that part there, with the shock at nearly full length, there's not a whole lot of droop on the arm. So I don't know when you would actually want to take that part off just so you can get more tunability, because the arm itself has, I think, 3 holes there that you can mount the shock to theoretically. So, okay, that's a little strange. Then as far as the steering rack goes, this whole arrangement here is the same as what you have on the second generation buggy. Okay, and third generation buggy, the B2 and B3 are substantially the same. The T2 very different from the B2. This whole steering rack is similar to the old 10T and World's Car style, but slightly different. You get an integrated servo saver here, and the actual pieces themselves are a little different. These are the same pieces, bell crank pieces you would use on the RC10 GT. But the original 10T had different bell cranks. They were basically more like the RC10 buggy ones, but with a longer piece to accommodate the longer wheelbase. So basically the steering assembly changed from the 10T to the T2 to the T3. For the buggy, it just changed from the Team Car or World's Car to the B2. And then B2 to B3, there was no change. It just stayed like this. So this is, the T2 is this really weird sort of intermediate design. It was only for one generation. They didn't really recycle much going into the next generation. Same thing with the rear. On the gearbox for the B2, this uses the same gearbox as the B3 and the T3. I think it's the internal drive ratio, if I remember correctly, it's 2.4 to 1. The T2 is a 2.6 to 1 gearbox, and it also mounts a little differently. So if we come in from the back side here, the way the rear gearbox mounts between, and it's the same with the T3 and the B2. You have the gearbox, and then this guy here, this happens to be aluminum. Normally the kit comes with a molded part. This is an aftermarket part here. So you got these two screws that go down into the gearbox, and then two mounting points here that mount from this side through the tower to this piece to mount the gearbox to the bulkhead. Okay, so this started on the second generation buggy. Second generation truck does have the front part of the gearbox mount through the tower, but it's not through this molded part. It's part of the actual gearbox molding itself. Okay, so similar mounting style, but it uses one less part on the second generation kit. And again, the gearbox itself is different final drive ratio. This is a 2.6 to 1. This is 2.4 to 1. And again, the T3 and the B2 and the B3, same gearbox. So this is also 2.4 to 1 gearbox. Okay, so the gearing you would use on the T2, you have to change a little bit for the T3 because you have to account for that different final drive ratio. What else? Shock tower geometry, also different. I haven't found myself having issues with the T2 as far as the rear suspension goes. I only ran it once last year at the Vintage Off-Road Nationals. It's a fantastic truck. It drives great. Much better than the original 10T, where I always had issues with it kind of bottoming out on jumps. This doesn't seem to have that problem. I would suspect that the T3 would be a little bit better still, because you do get a bit more droop, but that's because of this extra attachment piece here. You can do the same thing on the T2, but this also has longer suspension arms compared to the T2, both front and rear. So I suspect this would be a better truck to use on smoother tracks with bigger jumps. Probably what it was kind of designed for, and that's what tracks were evolving toward in the late 90s, early 2000s, so that kind of makes sense. The other thing with the rear that's a little different is the hub carrier itself. So the T3 and the B3 share the same rear hub carrier, where you basically have two mounting holes for the outer ball stud. On the T2 and the B2 and the RC10 GT, which you could argue is more like a first generation kit, it's a similar rear hub carrier, but it has one mounting point for the ball stud instead of two, so not quite as tunable. So the B3, T3, a little bit more tunable on the rear with the camber link locations. On the outside, on the inside, the inner rear ball stud mounts directly to the chassis. So the chassis is molded and it has this sort of kick-up piece in the back with two holes. This is exactly what you get in the B2. So second generation buggy and the B3 and the third generation truck all do this. The T2 kind of does that, but not quite, because you have this aluminum tub chassis. You can't fold that up to the back to have a hole in the aluminum tub for the ball stud to mount through the back. So there's another molded part here, this part of the rear bulkhead, where you mount the ball stud in from the back. And that just has 2 holes, inside and outside. Just like the 3rd gen truck and the 2nd gen buggy, 2 holes, inside and outside. I'm not too crazy about either of these arrangements. I mean, if anything, I'd rather have it like this on the T2, because if this happens to break, I only have to replace this part. A little bit like the 1st gen buggy, where you have this bulkhead here, and it has actually more holes, even though generally you only use 1 hole that's kind of drilled on the inside here. So if you break that hole, you just replace the bulkhead. You don't have to replace the chassis. If you break this for some reason, if you put enough stress at the right angle and the wrong conditions on this part here to snap this hole, you've just basically broken the entire chassis. Now you got to replace the whole chassis. Same thing with the buggy. It's mounted the same way, right? Now I haven't actually had a problem with that. I don't know if anyone ever has, but it is just something to point out that they, maybe to lower costs, they just fully integrated the whole thing into the chassis itself. Okay, fine. Yeah. What else kind of comes to mind? Nothing really. Technically speaking, the T3 and the B3 have a slightly different motor plate on the bottom. The B2 compared to the B2, where the motor plate's a little bit more straight like this, and the B3 it kind of has this little thing over here. But that's a very minor detail. Yeah, that's kind of it. So it's just sort of interesting to me that the way that truck generations evolved is a little bit different or staggered in their timeline compared to the buggies. That's not something you see in the modern day, where if you have, like, you know, the 4th generation associated platform isn't so modern. That was more like 15 years ago. But the T4, the B4, they all had the same exact, more or less, components, the same platform. You look at the Locies, like even the Loci XX, XXT, and then the XXCR, XXTCR, they kind of shared the same components in the same sort of generation. The Kyosho stuff, same thing. So it's kind of a peculiar case, maybe the only manufacturer where in the 90s they were updating the truck at sort of a different rate than they were updating the buggy. So anyway, just figured I'd point that out. Most of you guys who know vintage already know this, but this is more for people who aren't too familiar with these platforms. And just a quick reminder, once again, the next RC10 Talk Vintage race will have a Y2K stadium truck class. So that means 2 stadium truck classes. One for pre-2000 stadium trucks, like the T2 or the XXT, and one for post-2000 stadium trucks. Technically, the T3 started manufacturing in, I think, 1997, but they didn't end manufacturing until the early 2000s, I think 2002, 2003. So this does qualify for the Y2K class for a stadium truck. Thing is, you can also use like a Kyosho RT6 for the same exact Y2K stadium truck class. So I may bring this as well, just as backup. And this is way more tunable and way more advanced than the T3. But they both fit into the same class, technically speaking. Okay, anyway, I think I've rambled enough for now. So, yeah, thanks for watching.